the program to replace America's aging nuclear ICBM arsenal, known as the LGM-35A Sentinel, is spiraling out of budgetary control and is already projected to go at least 81% over budget, representing tens of billions of dollars in anticipated cost overruns. But despite the program's ballooning expenses, the Pentagon has reaffirmed its commitment to this effort, calling its continuation essential to national security. Now, to many outside the defense apparatus, the Sentinel ICBM program itself may seem sort of unnecessary. After all, the US already maintains a standing arsenal of more than 400 nuclear-armed Minuteman III ICBMs, each of which can deliver its nuclear payload to targets more than 8,000 miles away at speeds in excess of Mach 23. These weapons lay in wait, housed in hardened underground silos spanning Wyoming, Montana, and North Dakota, and represent only the land-based portion of America's traditional nuclear triad. But if you think the US can just rely on the Minuteman III forever, you'd be wrong. In fact, these weapons entered service starting in 1970 with a projected 10-year service life, and they have now been extended beyond their intended retirement date by over 44 years already. To put it simply, replacing America's ICBM arsenal is a nuclear can the Pentagon's been kicking down the road for better than 4 decades now, and at this point, there's little other choice but to finally pull the trigger. Or at least, that's what the Pentagon says. So I decided to try to get to the bottom of this, to assess whether or not it would even be feasible to extend the Minuteman III's service life into the foreseeable future, or if instead it just makes more economic and strategic sense to replace these 1960s era weapons for good. So let's dive headlong into America's nuclear missile problem. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. In order to understand why the Minuteman III is being replaced and what the problems are with the Sentinel ICBM program, we're gonna have to start with a fair bit of context, starting with what role these intercontinental ballistic missiles play in America's nuclear warfighting doctrine, and as a result, in America's deterrent nuclear posture. Or to put that into simpler terms, how would these weapons be used in a nuclear war, and how does the threat of that help prevent nuclear war from breaking out? And really, it's only after we understand all that that we'll be equipped to assess whether or not it makes any sense at all that the Pentagon took what was to be a $77 billion ICBM program and decided to keep it around even after going $64 billion additional dollars over budget. But don't get it twisted, Pentagon officials are not acting like these cost overages are normal or even okay, but instead have basically said that this is a crap sandwich that we've made for ourselves. And now, we have little choice but to eat it. In order to get to the bottom of this, we're going to have to split this discussion into 2 parts, starting with the status of America's Minuteman III ICBMs and the reason the Pentagon says they have to be replaced. Then we'll move on to the LGM-35A Sentinel program, what it set out to do and the reasons it's gone so wildly over budget, but most importantly, the reasons why the Pentagon and the Air Force in particular say, despite those overages, it is still very much worth pursuing this program. And we'll start with the fundamentals of what America's nuclear triad even is and how it's used. A bevy of nuclear gravity bombs spanning in yield from as low as 0.3 kilotons to as large as 1.2 megatons serve alongside long-range air-launched nuclear cruise missiles as the airborne leg of the triad. delivered via a laundry list of bombers and fighters. And then, most importantly, a fleet of 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, each carrying 20 Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missiles with multiple warheads on board, serve as the at-sea leg of the triad, while also representing the majority of America's deployed nuclear arsenal. And then we have the third leg, the land-based leg, represented by some 400 Minuteman III ICBMs. And in the grand scheme of things, the Minuteman III fleet is often seen as the least important facet of America's deterrent nuclear posture, with many experts and analysts dismissing these weapons and their hardened silos as little more than a warhead sponge, meant to give adversary nations such a long and daunting list of targets for any potential first strike that there's little hope of blunting the edge of America's nuclear response. But while this might make these ICBMs seem less important than the Navy's deployed SLBMs, for instance, the truth is, using these isolated facilities as a warhead sponge might actually make all the difference in a nuclear conflict. The known and permanent locations of these ICBM silos give enemy nations a list of hundreds of targets to focus on, allowing America's missile subs and nuclear-capable aircraft to retaliate with less interference. In other words, with hundreds of nuclear ICBMs laying in wait beneath the grasslands of the Great Plains, adversary nations planning a nuclear first strike must address the looming threat of these missiles, which are dispersed and sufficiently hardened to pretty much require a direct nuclear strike on each, to eliminate the possibility of Minuteman III-based retaliation. Even for Russia, who maintains the largest nuclear stockpile in the world and claims to have some 1,710 deployed warheads at any given time, this would be a huge challenge. If you assumed a broadly unlikely 100% hit rate using just one Russian warhead for each of America's known 450 Minuteman III silos, nerfing America's ICBM fields alone would require more than a quarter of Russia's entire deployed nuclear arsenal. But if Russia opted to more logically devote 2 warheads to each silo, it would dramatically increase their chances of success, but at the expense of more than half of the nation's deployed nuclear arms. This, of course, also means that no other nation on the planet besides Russia has enough warheads and the means to mount an effective attack against America's ICBM fields. China's nuclear stockpile is growing faster than any other nations in the world, but their entire arsenal is currently represented by just 500 or so warheads, meaning it could feasibly take just about every nuclear weapon in China's inventory, not deployed weapons, but in all, to have that same effect. It might be easier to think of the importance of the Minuteman III as a guard standing his post with his rifle up at the alert. Adversary nations know there are other guards hidden throughout the landscape, and the known location of that rifleman might make him an obvious target, but attackers still have to deal with him first if they intend to mount a successful assault. And of course, the time and resources it takes to do that benefits those other hidden guards, the other 2 legs of the nuclear triad. I'm going to quote Air Force Vice Chief of Staff General James Slife from a comment he made to reporters on July 8th. The land leg's geographic dispersal creates targeting problems for our adversaries, and our missileers sitting in an alert posture 24/7 ensures responsiveness. Now, I recognize that this is a cynical and deeply depressing way to see this swath of the American Midwest, with these remote but nonetheless populated communities carrying that target on their backs for the sake of the rest of the nation. But that is the inherent and objectively cold-blooded math of nuclear war. It's a game that ultimately has no winners. only survivors. And therein lies the magic, if you will, of the deterrent nuclear philosophy of our day: mutually assured destruction, which effectively amounts to a promise that if you nuke us, we will nuke you back, and our destruction will be mutually assured. And it's in the interest of continuing this nuclear game of chicken that the Air Force is now all but forced to swallow the now projected $140.9 billion cost of replacing those warhead sponge Minuteman IIIs, as the ballistic missiles Uncle Sam has long kept tucked beneath the northern Great Plains are rapidly aging into what the Pentagon considers to be unsafe and strategically neutered obsolescence. And this is certainly a problem that the Pentagon saw coming. Solving the problem that is America's rapidly aging ICBM arsenal is a nuclear can the Air Force has been kicking down the road for 40 some odd years now. The Minuteman III program began in the early 1960s, with the first operational missiles entering service in 1970, before microwave ovens were even common in American kitchens. At the time, the projected service lives of these weapons was just 10 years, meaning the Minuteman III arsenal was slated to be replaced starting in 1980, about 44 years ago. Since then, the branch has invested literally billions of dollars into not just maintaining these weapons, but updating them to stay viable in a rapidly changing technological world. After all, these missiles and their launch facilities were designed and built before personal computers, VCRs, portable tape players had been invented. In fact, it wasn't until 2019 that the Air Force finally migrated away from using 8-inch floppy disks from the 1970s to operate the Strategic Automated Command and Control System, or SACS, that's responsible for launch functionality. That's right, if you're around my age, that means that back in the early 1990s, you were playing the Oregon Trail at school on computers that were significantly more advanced than the ones running America's nuclear ICBMs in the 2010s. The dated electronics found throughout the Minuteman III weapon and support infrastructure create significant concerns about cybersecurity, a defensive realm that just didn't exist when these weapons were being designed. Likewise, despite updates and upgrades over the years, the Air Force has been clear that the Minuteman III's intercept countermeasures, or the classified systems carried on board these missiles meant to hinder an enemy's ability to shoot them down, are aging out of relevance, presenting the real possibility that the long-standing nuclear deterrent philosophy of mutually assured destruction may no longer be quite so mutually assured. But more pressing than concerns about hacking, or what I would consider to be the unrealistic idea that any adversary state could intercept hundreds of inbound warheads at the same time, are the continuously reduced reliability of aging systems and components that are now so old that there's no vendor, no contractor, no commercial entity that can support, repair, or replace them. At least, not without a prohibitively high price tag. To put it into simpler terms, the Minuteman III could be seen as the nuclear equivalent of a 1969 Dodge Charger. Its iconic design and powerful legacy are still more than enough to leave many in awe, but nobody in their right mind would actually want to race in that thing today. Its massive 440 cubic inch big block V8 produced only a bit more power than you can get in a modern Ford Focus RS. Now that was enough for the Charger to run from 0 to 60 in 6 seconds flat, or about a quarter second slower than a 2024 Toyota Corolla. But the Corolla has disc brakes, so it'll actually stop, while relying on the Charger's standard drum brakes could be seen as a form of voluntary euthanasia. Now, upgrading the Charger to make it not just safe, but actually competitive on a modern racetrack is absolutely possible with enough money and willpower, but there is no denying that it would just be a whole lot cheaper and easier to just buy a modern Hellcat and be done with it. And that's exactly what the Air Force determined in 2014, when it conducted what the Congressional Research Service describes as a comprehensive analysis of alternatives to the Minuteman III, ultimately assessing that replacing these aging weapons with new, more modern ones would reduce life cycle costs, while also ensuring America's ICBMs are technologically capable of outpacing emerging threats. Of course, there are always two sides to a debate, and others have argued that continued service life extension programs on the Minuteman III arsenal, replacing aging components with more modern ones, and eventually producing the ballistic missile equivalent of the ship of Theseus, might actually be the more cost-effective solution. That was the position taken by a group of analysts at the Rand Corporation that same year, in 2014, who were tasked with assessing possible alternatives to a new ICBM program, which at the time was known as the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program. While the Air Force's 2014 analysis concluded that modernizing the Minuteman III would cost just as much as replacing them, the Rand study presciently argued that a replacement ballistic missile system would, quote, likely cost almost twice and perhaps even 3 times as much as incremental modernization and sustainment of the Minuteman III system. But, and there is always a but, even that Rand analysis left the door open for replacement to be the logical conclusion based on a few potential factors. And the arguments for a new ICBM that Rand acknowledged as logical were if the Air Force felt the pressing strategic need to increase the capability of these weapons, which wouldn't be cost-effective using the old missiles as a basis, or if the threat environment outside the US changed in such a way that demanded it, such as emerging missile defense capabilities reducing the likelihood of success for Minuteman III strikes. The third and most pressing argument Rand recognized was the declining number of Minuteman III missiles the US actually has left to launch. You see, as a part of ensuring the land-based leg of the nuclear triad is ready and capable of responding to an attack, the US usually conducts between 4 and 5 ICBM test launches per year. If the US continues this pace of testing, it'll run out of extra weapons to launch by 2035, forcing the US to either halt test launches indefinitely or to start shaving operational weapons off of the inventory to be used for these tests. But as pressing as that issue actually is, the Air Force contends that there are several other challenges that they would have to face to keep the Minuteman III alive for the foreseeable future. And the first and most prominent is the aging out of rocket motors meant to carry these weapons to their targets. Now, rocket motor lifespans are determined by destructively testing a small number of them and measuring the degradation of physical, chemical, and mechanical properties to create statistical models that can be used to determine when the motor's functionality would fall below acceptable operational thresholds. In other words, they subject these rockets to immense stresses, measure the damage, and then use that data to extrapolate an expiration date for when the rocket will no longer work well enough to accomplish its mission. And while there have been reasonable arguments made that these expiration date calculations are done too conservatively, when it comes to nuclear weapons, most people would argue that it just makes sense to err on the side of safety. And based on the Air Force's rocket lifespan modeling, the 3 boosters found in each of the nation's Minuteman III ICBMs will begin to expire in 2029. The next technical hurdle another service life extension program would have to overcome is the weapon's guidance system also aging out of service. The Minuteman III originally came equipped with the NS-20 missile guidance system, which had already aged out of relevance by the 1990s, prompting the Air Force to kick off the Minuteman III guidance replacement program midway through that decade. Now, that program saw the NS-20 swapped out for the more modern and accurate NS-50 system to the tune of around $1.6 billion in 1995, or roughly $3.34 billion today, with the goal to extend the lifespan of these systems out to 2020. By 2012, the Federation of American Scientists reported that the Defense Department had already invested a total of $7 billion into various Minuteman III service life extension efforts, or roughly $9.7 billion in today's money, and it definitely didn't end there. As you might have noticed, 2020 came and went without a Minuteman III replacement, so the Air Force had to award several subsequent contracts to Boeing to stretch their lifespans out even further, this time to 2030 and beyond, when the Minuteman III's replacement is meant to come online. While not a conclusive list of these life-extending costs, public records exist for a $51.2 million contract awarded to Boeing for this job in January 2015. That's about $68.83 million in today's money, followed by at least 2 contract modifications to add another $15.6 million the following February, and then another $8.1 million in July, for an adjusted combined total of $31.43 million in contract adjustments and a total of around $100.26 million in 2024 currency. But even with all this invested, the Minuteman III still faced a laundry list of systems that are not only aging out of relevance, but aging out of being feasible to maintain and support. A 2019 analysis conducted by the conservative think tank Hudson Institute posited that between 2031 and 2033, as many as 50 missiles might age out of service due to motor or onboard systems falling below acceptable operational thresholds. And by 2037, the operational Minuteman III fleet could be as small as just 100 weapons. However, the Air Force awarded Boeing another $1.6 billion in February of 2023 for Minuteman III guidance subsystem support, which is likely to curtail at least a portion of these losses, even if it did mean eclipsing the $10 billion mark on service life extensions for these weapons. As the Pentagon sees it, continuing to funnel billions of dollars into keeping these Kirk and Spock-era weapons in service just isn't sustainable from either financial or strategic perspectives. As Lieutenant General Andrew Cabrera, Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Deterrence and Nuclear Integration, explained, the Air Force has already modeled out the costs of keeping the Minuteman III relevant, but even those projections have limited value because they just don't know what the future may hold. Adapting to unforeseen threats would objectively be simpler and cheaper with a fully modern system. In 2021, the head of U.S. Strategic Command, U.S. Navy Admiral Charles Richard, did not mince words regarding the future of the Minuteman III, saying it was simply no longer logical to pursue more service life extensions for the weapon, and even going so far as to issue harsh criticisms for external calls to do so. I'll quote him now. I don't understand, frankly, how someone in a think tank who doesn't have their hands on the missile, looking at the parts, the cables, all of the pieces inside that. I was out at Hill Air Force Base looking at this. That thing is so old that in some cases, the drawings don't exist anymore. Or where we do have drawings, they're 6 generations behind the industry standard. There's not only not anybody working that can understand them, they're not alive anymore. The Admiral went on to highlight concerns about cyber vulnerabilities, saying the U.S. needed to replace what was, quote, basically a circuit switch system with a modern, cyber-defensible, up to current standards command and control system. Quote, just to pace the cyber threats alone, the ground-based strategic deterrent is a necessary step forward. He also highlighted the changing threat environment, one of the factors the 2014 RAND analysis acknowledged would justify an ICBM replacement. I'll quote him again. This nation has never before had to face the prospect of two peer, nuclear-capable adversaries who have to be deterred differently, and actions to deter one have an impact on the other. This is way more complicated than it used to be. But if replacing the Minuteman III was supposed to be the budget-friendly solution, that appears to have backfired. Originally, Northrop Grumman and Boeing were competing for the opportunity to design and field this new missile, with both firms planning to use solid rocket motors produced by Aerojet Rocketdyne. But then Northrop Grumman purchased Aerojet Rocketdyne in 2019, giving them the ability to procure their rocket motors at cost and to set the cost for Boeing to do the same. Now, this allowed Northrop Grumman to significantly undercut Boeing's proposal, and recognizing that, Boeing bowed out, leaving Northrop to pursue this contract uncontested. And one might argue that that was only the beginning of the LGM-35A Sentinel program's problems. And I'll dive into those problems and the Air Force's intended solutions in the next episode. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.